Thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining us tonight for the Birchfield Penny Art Center's Book Club at the Center. I'm especially excited to greet tonight's featured author, Tim Wendel, who will share his book, Cancer Crossings, with us. But first, I'm going to turn it back to Michaela, who will share a little bit about how this evening will go. So, Michaela?
Right. Hi, everyone. So for this evening, just like our past book clubs, while we listen to Mary and Tim's discussion, please use the Q&A section to ask your own questions. So that button's at the bottom of your screen, and use the chat function to chat amongst yourselves. This is also being recorded and streamed onto Facebook. So if you're watching this through Facebook, please use the comment section there. I am looking at those as well, so I'll ask your questions to Tim. And if you aren't able to attend the entire meeting, we are recording this, so we can always send you a copy of this later. And only the panelists are being recorded this evening. So.
Thank you, Michaela. So as many of you know, my name is Mary Kozub, and I am the Education Program Manager at the Birchfield Penny Art Center. And this book club was started many years ago by some enthusiastic docents who wanted to read the books that Mr. Birchfield read so that we had a better understanding of who he was. Since then, we have moved on to read an incredible number of authors, all from the Western New York area, which is in keeping with our mission to support and appreciate and celebrate the incredible, diverse, and talented community that we live in. I'm especially excited to introduce you to Mr. Tim Wendel. He is the award-winning author of 14 books, including Summer of '68, Castro's Curveball, and tonight's featured book, Cancer Crossings. Tim, a Lockport native, has been a writer in residence at Johns Hopkins University. His stories and columns have appeared in the Esquire, GQ, Gargoyle, the New York Times, the Washington Post, USA Today, Psychology Today, and National Geographic. He's a graduate of Syracuse University and received a master's degree at Johns Hopkins University, where he teaches today. So Tim, thank you so much for joining us. And I'm going to turn things over to you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Michaela. It's great to be back in Western New York, even if it's virtually. I mean, I can feel the love. We're going to do, I'd like to do a short PowerPoint just to kind of get you up to speed on these amazing group of doctors and what went on in Roswell Park more than a half century ago. I'm a Bills fan. I'm a Sabres fan. I cheer for, everything that comes out of Western New York. But in a lot of ways, I think one of the biggest success stories was what these doctors were able to do in the world of childhood cancer specifically. We hear a lot these days about, oh, we need a moonshot for cancer. Well, I think we already had one, and it was about 50 years ago. And if we can maybe emulate or follow that example of some of these doctors a little bit more, we'll probably have more of them. Here's these doctors. They were a small group, doctors, nurses, and for a long time headquartered at Roswell Park in Buffalo. And they were called a lot of different names because they were ostracized by the medical community. Now, some might say, well, hang on, why were they ostracized? They're trying to take on this terrible disease and help out kids. And pretty much at this point in time, if you looked up leukemia in the Handbook of Pediatrics, roughly mid-60s, you would find less than 2 pages. And pretty much it would say, make the patient as comfortable as possible because he or she will not be with us that much longer. That was unacceptable to these guys. And there was men and women. And this seems like a big crowd. This is actually from Look magazine that did a story on them in 1968. But this was pretty much the entire group nationally that dared to take on childhood leukemia at this point in time. For a large number of doctors, they were told by their mentors, even their medical schools, don't go into this field. It's a loser, and do something else. That was unacceptable to these gentlemen and ladies, and we'll get into that. Now, people are saying, okay, why are you writing about this? My brother Eric was diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia, ALL, roughly in the mid-60s. So suddenly our family story, and certainly his story, becomes intertwined with the cancer cowboys. And the cancer cowboys were one of the terms they were given by their peers, which was less than, in a sense, trying to single them out or almost make fun of them. They were also called a great many other names, like poison pushers, misfits, etc. Eric contracted ALL, and in a sense, he ended up becoming a patient at Roswell Park. And again, one of the things in Cancer Crossings is it's part family memoir, but it's also part medical narrative. And one of the things that was sometimes a struggle, but it worked, was finding those pivot points or those places where what was going on in the medical world impacted our family. Now, one of the things we did as a family, and my father was a very big sailor, within a year of Eric's diagnosis, we were suddenly sailing, first out of Youngstown on Lake Ontario, and then out of Alcott. And it was, we certainly embraced sailing. We would sail all the way across Lake Ontario more times than I can imagine or remember, going to the Canadian shore, which is one of the reasons why I called the book Cancer Crossings. It's interesting what is kind of kept hidden in a family and what comes out later. When I was finishing up Cancer Crossings, I called up my father. And you've got to remember, for my father, who just passed on in the last year, sailing was this magical activity. Knowing how to read the wind was a spiritual activity to him, because to him, the wind is invisible. It's always changing direction. It's always changing velocity. And if you could do that, then potentially you could trim your sails and do pretty well out on the lake. He found it a great metaphor for living a life. When I was finishing Cancer Crossings, I called up Dad and said, hang on, you taught us all how to sail and got us involved in boats and all this. He knew about boats beforehand. Did you do this as a pushback against having a son diagnosed with leukemia? And there was this pause at the end of the phone line. And then he said, of course it was. So there you go. Family, sailing, leukemia, it's all starting to come together. All right, a little bit of a history lesson, because you people, especially from Western New York, need to know these people, because as I was talking to Sean Kurz from the Buffalo News a while ago, we should be putting up statues to these people because they did amazing, amazing work. You go way back, before there was a Roswell Park, there was a Roswell Park, the doctor. And he was a very prominent surgeon before, and since the late, early 1900s. Now, one reason you bring them up, and if you even go to the now renovated Roswell Park Cancer Center in Buffalo, you will see a plaque up there somewhat about Roswell Park, but it'll have a very kind of interesting story. Back when William McKinley, President McKinley, was shot in Buffalo, and in a sense looked like he was going to live, Roswell Park, the doctor, was in surgery at that point in Niagara Falls. He soon raced to the scene, but in a very kind of strange, almost too gentlemanly arrangement, the doctor who was, in a sense, had taken over, who was the first on the scene, was allowed, in a sense, to do the procedure. Of course, McKinley died, gangrene, bullet wound, opening, and then Theodore Roosevelt becomes the next president. The cancer cowboys knew this story. And even though it had happened decades before they come on the scene, they saw it as a cautionary tale. They saw it as, we have to, in a sense, egos need to be bruised, so be it. The patient comes first, doing the best medicine first. The doctor who can really treat the patient should move front and center. So to them, that whole incident of McKinley's assassination and the involvement of Roswell Park was pretty important to them. It was a history lesson they refused to forget. All right, let's advance up a little bit. Now we're into the late 50s, kind of early 60s, and the person who becomes front and center at Roswell Park forms the first multi-institutional group going, combating cancer, is Dr. James Holland. I loved all the origin stories of how the cancer cowboys of various doctors came to not only Roswell Park, but to be treating cancer patients. Dr. Holland had actually grown up in a family where, in a sense, lawyers were front and center. He was groomed to be a lawyer. And then he was at Princeton, I believe, yeah, Princeton. And he still, in the interviews I did with him, still remembered vividly the first time he ever looked through a microscope, in a sense, at cells and what they were doing. His life changed from that point. And he became one of the very first people to say, we can do better in terms of cancer treatment. Here he is with one of the other prominent doctors from those early days or the 1960s at Roswell Park, Jerry Yates, who still makes his home in Orchard Park and has taught for many years at University of Buffalo. Now, one of the things, the Holland family, when they were in Buffalo, lived just a little bit past Delaware Park. And obviously, Dr. Holland is kind of the main event, so to speak. I mean, he's running this big group. He's doing amazing things in terms of research, but his wife was also a very esteemed doctor. And she did something that I think we're still, in a sense, teasing out today and still finding very useful. Jimmy Holland, yes, the Hollands were James and Jimmy, believe it or not. She was from Texas originally. And when all of this major research was getting going at Roswell Park and then a little bit at some other hospitals, all the doctors would come in from around the country at times into Buffalo. And they wouldn't really go out to a restaurant necessarily after being at the hospital. They'd come to the Holland's house. And one of the nights at one of these gatherings, Jimmy Holland, a doctor in her own right, asked these, acclaimed doctors, have you really kind of studied the emotion level and what's happening to the patients as, in a sense, they're being treated with these growing number of cancer-fighting drugs? And pretty much the response was no. We're working it out. We're trying to do the best thing we can do in terms of the meds. What she determined very quickly, and on the right, you see one of the old isolation units at Roswell Park, because on paper, it made perfect sense. If you're fighting cancer, your immune system's been kind of beaten down, you've got all these cancer fighting drugs flowing through your system, it would make sense to put you in an isolation chamber where germs could not, in a sense, settle in. It didn't work. And what Jimmy Holland determined was after less than 72 hours, in many cases, the patients missed touch. They missed, in a sense, interaction. And in a sense, they would go downhill even if the meds seemed to be right on the mark. One of the most acclaimed doctors to come out of the Roswell Park group and out of Buffalo, and he was born a proud Buffalonian, was Dr. Donald Pinkel. He was the first director of pediatrics at Roswell Park. His goal was to stay in Buffalo and pretty much grow, with that department, grow with the hospital. Unfortunately, due to his health, he had to leave the area. Winters were a little bit, were too tough on his system. So he went to Memphis, and he's the one who started up St. Jude Research Hospital. That's him with Danny Thomas, the actor, of course. Now Marlo Thomas, his daughter, is the one still championing St. Jude. They're the ones, the names are remembered, but it's Donald Pinkel who put St. Jude on the map. And Dr. Pinkel, who now makes his home out in California, I remember one of the interviews I did with him, he said, if I knew what bad situation, how dire the economic situation, the finances were for St. Jude, I never would have taken that job. But he's the one who got it built and made it into the institution it is today. Dr. Lucius Sinks, he's the one who takes over for Dr. Pinkel as director of pediatrics. He is the one who treated my brother, Eric. The photo on the left is again from that Look magazine article. And I'm not, I certainly don't have a lot of medical training. And one of the things I'll always be grateful for Dr. Sinks for is I met regularly with him in the course of writing this story. And what you see on the right is I was having a very difficult time understanding what my brother was going through and many other kids in terms of treatment until Dr. Sinks pretty much wrote it all down over a timeline, in essence, what meds were being taken, when my brother was in remission, when he relapsed, etc. And all of a sudden, there's the timeline. There's the frame that I can now follow through and write the story. All right, let's talk about some of these drugs. These are many of them we know today, vincristine, prednisone, methotrexate, etc. With the exception of probably vincristine, all these were coming on the scene in the mid-60s. And it created a real churn, and again, a lot of finger pointing and back and forth between the medical community. We were talking before we came on, there's been some amazing work, obviously, it's come out of the Boston area, the Dana-Farber Institute. The guy who wrote Emperor of All Maladies, with a doctor there, etc. But one of the things they tried to do is all these new meds were becoming available. They tried to treat or study each one almost individually. And as Dr. Pinkel pointed out, he said, cancer moves too fast for that. It's too devastating. If you're sitting there studying the next major thing like Cytoxan or Donomycin, you're probably going to lose the patient. So one of the big leaps of faith the Cancer Cowboys did, and it originated in Buffalo, was starting to use chemotherapy drugs, more and more of them coming on the scene in combination, 2, 3, maybe 4 times in combination. And a lot of it was a little bit seat of the pants. Again, the studies maybe weren't all borne out, but the thing is they were keeping more and more patients alive. More and more kids were going into remission, even though the regimen sometimes was very difficult. Now, the final obstacle really in terms of where we've gone in childhood cancer. And you got to remember when my brother was diagnosed, it was about a 15% survival rate. Today, if a kid is diagnosed with ALL, God forbid, he or she will have more than a 90% survival rate. Now, they were using more and more of those drugs. They're putting kids in remission, but they weren't staying in remission. And that became the final riddle. How do you keep them healthy? How do you keep them in remission? And when the cancer would come back at times, it would be devastating. And what they discovered through studies was, in a sense, we have what they call a blood-brain barrier. Say you got injected with some bad poison or something happened to you tomorrow, this barrier would keep it from accessing the brain and down the spinal column. Okay, that's great in regular world. But the thing is, it was keeping the meds, the cancer fighting meds, from getting everywhere they needed to be. And the cancer is finding refuge often in the spinal fluid. So, and this is one of the things I love about the Cancer Cowboys, is all along to this point, it was more in terms of meds, procedures, whatever. As much as the patients, as much as the kids can tolerate, okay, we're gonna give it. But that wasn't working here. It wasn't moving the medicine past the blood-brain barrier. So what they did was shift, a radical shift, which I find amazing. They went from more to, hang on, slow down here a minute. What if we did less dosages, but extended it over a longer period of time? It worked. It allowed drugs like methotrexate, Cytoxan, etc., to get in and finally get rid of that last refuge where the cancer was hiding out. It's funny sometimes after Cancer Crossings came out, I miss my brother terribly, but at times people go, oh, that's too bad. Eric died in 1973, but he was only supposed to live 18 months. He gave us 8 years. And I think our family considers that a great gift. And I know in talking with other families, other parents, they're just so thankful for what the Cancer Cowboys did and how they kind of gave a longer life than what was expected. And these kids, and certainly the patients, and I would certainly say the families and the suffering parents, they've had a lasting impact. Again, think of that arc. You know, my daughter, who's now a doctor, she was in medical school. We'll get to this in a sec from the reading, but she's the one who pointed out to me, Dad, when your brother was diagnosed, it was 15% survival rate. Now it's more than 90. And that's an incredible shift. And it's happened in the last half century. And we're moving ahead. You're seeing more and more initiatives. They're less, brutal on the patients. One of the ones I've been identified with and helping somewhat is with the new Children's Initiative, with the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. In a sense, getting back to the same spirit of discovery and movement ahead that was happening in the 60s and 70s. Things stalled somewhat after the cancer cowboys, went different places. Adult cancer, and maybe deservedly so, became front and center. What the Children's Initiative now is trying to do is make cancer treatment 100% effective for kids. And that's been kind of languishing for a little bit. I'd like to read just from something and then we'll go to questions. And this is from early on in Cancer Crossings, even though it's one of the last things that was written, because we were trying to figure out, why this book and why do it in this way? Why take a long look back, especially to a time when everything in my family seemed to be taken to such extremes, when we seem to be living well outside ourselves, so far beyond what passed for a normal life. For me, it began with a simple question or two, an interest that opened the door to a past I'd largely forgotten or never fully knew. My daughter, Sarah, who I mentioned before, was in her first year at medical school. This was at Georgetown. And every week seemed to bring another examination about another disease that can kill you. Seemingly every malady ever known to man. Dad, you had a brother who died, right? She asked during this period. Yes, leukemia, I told her. He died when I was 17. And he was how old? He was 10 years old. Eric died in 1973. Thanks to her studies, Sarah knew that kids suffering from leukemia today have a much higher chance of surviving, even enjoying full lives. And the doctors, the treatment he received, Sarah asked. Between the lines, I knew that Sarah was asking if Eric would have been better off at a bigger city hospital, say in New York or Boston or Washington or Baltimore. I told her that my brother had actually been, very lucky. He was cared for at Roswell Park in Buffalo, New York, which has long been recognized as one of the best cancer facilities in the country. Then that means your brother was right there when they were trying to find a cure. Yeah, I suppose he was. Don't you see, Dad? They eventually did it. When it comes to leukemia, most kids are now living to be adults. After Sarah left that evening, was over for dinner at her house, I found an article online entitled, or from the New England Journal of Medicine entitled, Comparison of Intermediate Dose of Methotrexate for Post-Induction Treatment of Acute Lymphoblastic Leukemia in Children. One of its authors was Lucius Sinks, who my mother reminded me was the director of pediatrics when Eric was at Roswell Park. Soon I came to another article, this one from St. Jude Children's Hospital in Memphis, for which Donald Pinkel was one of the founders and one of the authors. Pinkel had founded the Department of Pediatrics at Roswell Park in 1956 and was a member of the first multi-institutional group for the study of cancer, the acute leukemia group B. Sarah had been right. When my brother was diagnosed in the mid-1960s, less than 15% of the children with the disease survived. Today, that statistic has risen to more than 90%. A wealth of research papers, clinical trials, and scientific journals detailed this amazing turnabout, and many were written by the same doctors: Sinks, Holland, Tom Fry, Pinkel. Thanks to decades now of writing for newspapers and magazines and now doing my own books, I've learned how to talk to people, and more important, to listen to what they have to say. If anything, I'm willing to be captivated by the mad ones, as Jack Kerouac once wrote, the ones who are mad to live, mad to talk, mad to be saved, desirous of everything at the same time. In the story of childhood leukemia, a small group of doctors in such locales as Memphis, Boston, Houston, Washington, and notably Buffalo was known as the Mad Ones, the ones who dared to take on this shapeshifter of a disease and somehow carry the day. You're doing it again, a good friend of mine said. You're investigating a group of underdogs and how they came together, how they overcame great odds. So where were the leukemia doctors now? How many of these medical pioneers were still working or even alive? What did they think of their efforts years after such procedures and studies had turned the medical world upside down? And what were the points and places where their struggle against childhood leukemia and my family's own history came together? My daughter's simple question led to so many more. With that in mind, I began the search for my brother's doctors. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Before I ask any questions, I have a comment I'd like to make. I didn't know what I was quite getting myself into. And I was totally surprised that a book about cancer just could be so exquisitely written, could be so full of warmth and love and joy and humor and lots of medical facts peppered in between these incredible stories of your family. And so I'm wondering about your own process and how did you lay it all out? How did you think that those stories, and I love what you said about your father in the sailboat, and how did it all come together?
Not very easily, Mary, but I guess a lot of trial and error. And a story that comes to mind, I started to have lunches with Dr. Sinks down in Charlottesville, ironically, where I live now. And I would come down from Northern Virginia outside of Washington and visit him. And we'd get together for lunch. And we always had lunch at the same place, at the same table. And we sat in the same chairs pretty much. And I always wanted to be first. And I pretty much was. And in the first couple conversations we had didn't go all that well. He must have been thinking, wow, I was part of this epic, effort, Herculean, task. And this is the guy who shows up, who's asking questions about it, wants to write a book about it. And they weren't going very well. And I felt the learning curve for me was very, very steep. I've done novels, I've done a lot of sports books. This is a lot different in a lot of ways, even despite my friends saying I was writing about underdogs again. I think it was our third lunch. And again, I'm there first, I'm waiting, and which I'll like to be. And he comes in, and at that point in time, and the race was on because almost all these doctors were, the other thing I'd done that night after Sarah left was check number one, if they were alive. Most were, but most were in their 80s. And I still can remember I still have all this stuff on my writing desk and just kind of moving it all to one side. The race was on, and the race was on a couple different fronts. The race was on, can I reach, like Holland and Pinkel and Sinks, et cetera. And the other race is, can I understand enough of this to write about it? So that third lunch with Lucius, I'm waiting for him. He's coming in, and he came in and he had this big white canvas bag. And I went, ooh, I don't know. Maybe he stopped off at the store. Maybe he got something before here. And he came and just dropped the bag in the middle of the table. Big boom. And I went, okay, what are we doing, Lucius? And he started pulling out. One was a massive book. It had to be more than 2,000 pages. Actually, one of the authors was James Holland, about cancer. Another one was other books about it, etc. And he just said, I'm going to loan you these for as long as you need, because you're starting to write, that you're starting to ask the right questions. And I remember thinking to myself, yes, we might be able to pull this off.
And even though we know Eric died, sadly, tragically, the book is still filled with both hope and gratitude. And so where do you find those emotions looking back all these years? I'm sure you didn't have them at the time, or your family.
No.
Maybe you're, but I have a sense your parents were always grateful.
Yeah, I think my parents were grateful. My mom was especially giving in her time because she was the one taking Eric from Lockport, where we were living, up to Roswell Park. But I don't know, may you find this, Mary, there's a very interesting, I'm always kind of amazed with memoir, and it's not like I write a lot of memoir, but I'm amazed by it, where if you can get a little bit of a clue or a little bit of a prompt, suddenly you can start to remember it yourself. And I was very fortunate in my family. I've got my middle brother, Chris. He knows every date. I can't remember any dates. And I'll say, when did we get that boat, or when did that happen there? He would know it like that. So again, I'm able to kind of start putting together that timeline, which is important, I think, if you're going to try to do something of narrative. And the other person who was really pivotal a lot was my sister, Susan, because Susan, even though she's very much no nonsense, is she somehow knew.
She's got a little devil in her, though. I read.
Oh, very much. Always has. But she would be able to, encapsulate what we were feeling or thinking at various points, which again, I was having a difficult time doing. And so if you combine both of those, you kind of know the date, you start to know kind of what transpired, and you're starting to realize what's the emotion. Oh, we're off to the races then.
I see. Can you talk a little bit about your decision to humanize these doctors? You don't see them just simply as doctors, but as human beings that had their own struggles. And I think it was Dr. Pinkel who you mentioned had a family of his own. He's the one that had polio himself. He had this job at Roswell, watching very sick children, oftentimes dying. And he almost walked away from it until he said something to the effect of, if the children can be this brave, if their parents can go through it, what's wrong with me unless I do it too? If you saw a child drowning, would you not help that child? And I just thought it was so beautiful how you really, when one reads the book, you have an appreciation for the fact that the doctors and the nurses were people, three-dimensional people with their own set of emotions and feelings.
Yeah,
So,
very, very much. I think that only comes out, I think, if you have several conversations. And it's interesting you bring up Dr. Pinkel, who very reluctantly left Buffalo because of his polio, had to go to a warmer climate, but he took everything to heart with his patients. I mean, for the last couple of years, the family was there. They were living up near Delaware Park. They moved over to the Canadian side. He said, I had to get away a little bit more. They were just across the Peace Bridge near Crystal Beach. And yet he could find a way to go back each day to Roswell Park. And you got to remember, early on, the odds were horrific. I mean, they weren't saving a lot of kids back then, yet they still believed. And I think it's always, it's interesting because I think we tend to put, I think, doctors, medical people, nurses, or whatever, up on this pedestal. And somehow when we do so, and maybe it's just because of our healthcare system, the way we go to the doctor and such, and so little time, we don't see the humanity. We don't see the emotion. And I think if there's anything I'm really proud of with the book, I was able to delve into that and learn more about their emotion. And I think for almost every doctor, nurse, especially from the 60s and 70s in Roswell Park, and even a little bit beyond, that I spoke with, we had this shared kind of experience. As soon as I had heard that I had a brother with ALL, oh, okay, here we go. And now we're going to a little bit different level. It's funny when you bring that up, Mary, I'm reminded of one of the times I was talking to Dr. Holland, and most of our conversation, almost all, I think, were on the phone. And he was very, he did not suffer dumb questions, shall we say. And sometimes I specialize in those. And he would.
I don't think so.
But it became very apparent what time of the day to catch him. It was like about 4:15 or so as he's kind of finished up. He was at Mount Sinai at that point. And he's one of our earlier conversations. He said, okay, you can catch me between 4:15 and 4:30. I'll give you the time you want. Good questions. That's what I want, and I'll give you some time, but I'm out of here by 5. So, you had to kind of hit it running, but once you did so, there was a lot of appreciation. And boy, you talk about a guy who took on immense odds. Dr. Holland sure did.
I have a question too about how, and maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think I am. The story after story about your family's experiences seem to be an ongoing metaphor for the larger struggles that your family had. Even the Jim Schoenfeld versus the Bruins and the big fight they had served for me, to talk about the endless fight and struggle and the heroics that your family and other families with children suffering from leukemia face.
Yeah, you're a good reader, Mary. If you think about it, there's several. I give accounts of several trips across Lake Ontario. Going to Toronto, which we did a lot. Again, that was my dad's way of kind of showing us as a way forward. Almost, I don't believe any of them in the book are joy rides, shall we say. There's something going on, and it's not like each one's like, turns into Gilligan's Island or something, but so there's something overcoming. And I think this is what you can kind of do as a writer. I had kind of decided, I worked with some great editors, especially the top one, Dean Smith at Cornell. This is what we would talk about. Okay, you got a plethora of things you can choose from. Which one best, signifies it, or in a sense, even without being totally outspoken, kind of reflects the times. And as I was just reading there, I look back at my childhood and I want to trade it for anything, but I must admit at times I wanted it maybe less extreme. I wanted it, be able to come off the school bus and know dinner's going to be there at 5:30 or something like that, much more predictable. But if anything, it shows you life.
Well, I thought of all the trips, the one where there was no place to sleep, no room at the inn, I think you called it, and you just tied up to the shore in Toronto and made it work. And then you make things work. And one of my favorite, and it was, I think early on, before I caught on the way you were using these tales to tell a bigger story, was when the doctor bent down. The kids were putting together little puzzles, and the doctor bent down and said to your brother, Eric, do you like putting puzzles together? And because that is what it was, just one big puzzle. What piece is going to fit? What piece is going to make the picture a little clearer? And I just think you're a master writer. I thoroughly enjoyed the book.
Thank you. Well, sometimes you look into things too. It's funny. The cover's behind me too. But when I showed, I think it was Dr. Sinks, the cover when it was just about ready to come out, and I didn't really have much say in the cover, but he loved it. And I went, okay, what, you like this boat or something? What do you like about it? And he goes, no, I like the waves. I go, you like the waves? And I hadn't even thought about this. And if when you look at the cover, the waves aren't uniform. There might be uniform in kind of shape or flow, but some are thicker, some are a little bit, thinner, some are even more speckled. And he loved it because he said, that's like our clinical trials. Now, at this point, he'd lost me. And I said, okay, Lucius, what are you talking about now? And he said, that's the way it is with clinical trials. If each clinical trial, each time you try out a new med, try out a new approach, and it's exactly the same as what happened before, you're not learning anything. And so what he did, in saying that, was we were looking for the little variances, the little things that would show us the differences. And then we can go back in and start doing some quality procedures.
Michaela, I know you have some questions, so would you be kind enough to read them?
Sure. Actually, we have a couple of really great comments. The first I'm going to read is from Peter Holland. He says, "Hi, Tim. This is Peter Holland. Thank you for writing this amazing book. It is so nice to learn things about my father that I never knew, and to feel your sincere admiration for him and my mother." And he is looking for a link to the recording, which I will send him tomorrow. So,
yeah, Peter's great. Peter's great. We'll have a lot of fun.
This second comment is from Lorna Fitzpatrick. She says, "Good evening. My father, who told me about your talk tonight, was John Fitzpatrick. The Cancer Cowboys were well-known figures in our home, and along with my father, inspired me to become a pediatric hematologist/oncologist. Thanks for sharing. Moving, powerful, and a great testimonial to a wonderful group of doctors who are 100% committed to conquering childhood cancer."
Yeah, her father's an incredible doctor. I think, well, he would have been on, I guess, tonight. I guess he's over in Ireland. He finally got his trip to Ireland. John's great. And actually, just as an aside, Michaela, I'm going to interrupt just a bit. John had, like a sailing dinghy that he actually donated to Alcott Yacht Club. And that was very generous of him to do it. In fact, after he did so, he called me up and said, "You can call it anything you want." And I just went, "Well, of course, we're going to call it Eric. That's what we're going to call it." And he totally agreed.
So those are all the comments I had for now, Mary, if you have some other questions.
Well, I do have a question, and I hope it's not too hot a topic, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So in the book, you talk about the chicken pox that your brother unfortunately did get, and how I'm wondering about how important it is for people to be vaccinated today against COVID to protect those kids that really need to be protected, and adults too. But I think about the kids. My own son had a terrible allergic reaction to his measles, mumps, and rubella shot, and could not have another vaccine until he was an adult. And so I was always really grateful to everybody else who had their children vaccinated, including my younger daughter was vaccinated to protect my son. So I'm wondering how you feel about the anti-vaxxers. And
I've written some op-ed columns about that, and we'll just say I don't have a lot of patience. And somehow in this whole realm, we've allowed emotions to override facts. And at times I just don't get it. But it's funny that the correlation, to back up a bit, in essence, my brother's immune system was so beaten down from the meds he was taking that it was chicken pox that pretty much killed him. And people go, "What?" But this is before we had a vaccine for chicken pox. And this came up in a conversation I was having with Dr. Pinkel. And this is one of the things I always cherish, from these doctors, the cancer cowboys, nurses, et cetera, is they were often several steps ahead of me. So we're talking about chicken pox, how it can be devastating, even though it seems to be just a childhood thing for, a kid whose immune system is severely compromised. And as we're finishing up that conversation, that was a phone conversation, Dr. Pinkel said, "Okay, give me your address." And I said, "Okay," and I did. And then we chatted about something else, and I didn't think anything more of it. And then about 3-4 days later, from California came an envelope from him, and it was a copy of a report, a clinical trial that he had done in 1963, just about how devastating chickenpox can be for immunocompromised kids. And I went, "Whoa, there it is." What my family would have given for a chickenpox vaccine is,
right.
amazing. So, I think we've got to be very careful, and I think it dovetails a little bit back to your question earlier, where we're being treated by human beings and they have emotions and they have feelings too. And I think sometimes we forget that. And again, I think in some of maybe COVID land or why we've been reacting to the pandemic, we've allowed emotions at times to somehow supersede what the science is. And I think that's to our own detriment.
I agree. One thing that towards the end of the book, you mentioned that by 2010, 1 in 250 adults between the ages of 20 and 45 will be a survivor of childhood cancer. That is astounding to me.
Yeah, think of where we were. That's how much, these individuals, men and women, have swung the needle. It's
and all those lives may have been lost had it not been for the cowboys.
Yeah, very much. And most notably the patients too,
Determination.
and the families, I would say. I mean, because, it's, especially Roswell Park, St. Jude, et cetera. One of the things people need to remember is that, in a sense, my parents, other parents weren't paying, in a sense, for, this wasn't part of their healthcare or whatever. It wasn't coming out of their pocket, but in a sense, they were allowing their kids to become, guinea pigs, for lack of a better term. And in a sense, with the belief that what we could learn could then further our understanding of this. Cancer, I think, as everybody knows, is again, as I mentioned in the reading, a shapeshifter of a disease. It just can, do all these different things. And it's, I've just finished up a book with Dr. Ashiringa at Johns Hopkins. She's one of the top melanoma experts in the world. And she's just was put on President Biden's cancer, initiative team. And so again, some of the conversations I was having with her and the way she would talk about cancer, I felt like I was back talking with Dr. Holland again, or Dr. Pinkel. It's this adversary very much admired, and yet, they're very much determined to try to do the best for their patients.
You just wrote a book with her?
Yeah, it'll be coming out on December 12th.
Okay.
It's called "Is Cancer Inevitable?" I ghost wrote it. It'll pretty much be her. It's her book.
Okay.
But, it was a lot of fun.
Fair
So.
enough. I do have a question, a little bit of an unresolved. For me, towards the end of the book, you talk about Jackie and how you ask this question: why does everyone I love die? You lost your friend to a car accident, and you just lost your grandmother, I believe, and of course you lost Eric, and so I don't know. I felt unresolved about that. What happened then after you asked that question?
I think my best way to maybe answer that is, she's an extraordinary woman. I married her. We will have been now married 39 years. So maybe that's how you get through. You find, life's slippery. Life can flip around on you before you know it. And maybe the only way forward is you find a couple people that you can really, really believe it. And she's that for me. So, and it's, that was, that comment, that whole incident, I'm thinking now, that was kind of unusual for me, because I usually play my cards very close to my vest, so to speak. But for me to even say something like that was a little bit out of character, but then I got the response that I needed, so to speak. It was pretty much, I'm here. So it's good.
Well, I'm glad I asked the question, because I feel much better now that I know.
That's right. We're still together. It's good.
The rest of the story, right? Well, thank you for that. Michaela, do you have any other questions before?
We do, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we have one question here in the Q&A. If anyone has any more questions, please use them now. So this is from Jane. She says, I know you came from, and she hasn't read the book yet, a large family, and wondered how it affected the members of your family, especially the children. Your mom and dad are amazing people.
So how did it affect the family?
Yeah, yeah.
I think one of the things, a large family, 6 kids. And I think one of the things it did is and I'm not judging other families or whatever, but we're all very, very different, myself and my siblings, how we look at the world, etc. But one of the things we don't do maybe as much as other families is certainly we'll have disagreements and we'll have arguments, but we don't hold grudges, and I think if there was one of the lessons from Eric's situation was time short. And so that kind of impacts a number of things. First of all, I don't think you hold grudges or, you always talk to people that you love. I think the other one is if time's short, well, you probably should do what you want to do, in a life. And that's one of the things I ask, say, my students a lot at Johns Hopkins. I mean, a lot of them come into my grad level classes, writing classes, and it'll throw some of them because I'll ask them, what do you really want to do? And no, it's not to make me happy. It's not to even necessarily get the degree. It's what do you want to do with this short, precious life you have? And I think that's a large part of, the legacy of Eric. I mean, again, we'll fight, but, we may fight, but the next week we're talking to each other again.
Well, thank you. It's really been a wonderful opportunity. I feel this has been a great opportunity to have a chance to meet you after reading your incredible book, and I encourage everyone to read it. And I invite everyone to come to the Birchfield Penny Arts Center Friday, November 12th between 4:30 and 7, when you can meet Tim Wendel and have a chance to ask questions in person.
Ask me the other question.
There. That's right. He'll be joining us. And,
can I throw in one last thing, Mary? If we've got a little bit of time.
Throw in as many things as you like.
Just one. One of the things I had a lot of fun doing, well, fun maybe isn't quite the right word, but I did the audio book for Cancer Crossings. It was the first audio book I did. And I've now gone on and done audio books for several of my novels, one of my baseball books, etc. And doing the audio book for this was tough. It was tough emotionally, but I still remember we did it for 3 nights in a recording studio in DC. And we did 75 pages a night. And my voice was shot after 3 nights of this. I felt like, I don't know, some rock and roll singer after touring North America. But after the last night, they said, okay, you're going to need to come back in and we'll do pickups. I didn't know really quite what they meant by pickups. Pickups are the mistakes you've made. And I came in a couple of weeks later and they were set up and I still was trying to figure out what we were going to do. And I went in the little recording booth where I'd done it before, which they kind of intimidated me by saying, yeah, that's where John McCain did his book. That's where the Shakespearean actor Susan Teach did his book. I'm going, don't tell me anything more. And I just started kind of flipping through the pages going, what do we got to do here? I had messed up so many of the medical terms, donomycin, Cytoxan, methotrexate, etc. And I had to go through and say those and say them the correct way with the right inflection. And sometimes I'll still wake up in the middle of the night going donomycin, Cytoxan. And I must have been walking out of that studio that night after doing the pickups. I was just going, you're an idiot. But if you just did the audiobook for your most difficult book to narrate. And it kind of, in a way, opened up a new world for me. In fact, I just finished doing, boy, this was a leap. If somebody had told me a couple of years ago, I just finished narrating a book of poems for my friend Dean, who was the editor at Cornell, who's now down at Duke. And if somebody had said, you're going to narrate a book of poems, I just said, you're crazy. But this is how the world works. You try to persevere through and it opens up something else. It's been grand being with you. tonight.
I bet you got the arsenic and leeches correct, because you mentioned those in the book as well.
I got some right, at least the first ever.
I do have one little quote I'd like to end with, if it's okay.
Oh, please.
Real success comes about when you bring people together, but that only happens when groups find a way to reach out, think about more than what's right in front of them. And of course, that was your father's quote that was in his obituary.
That's right.
And it kind of tells the whole tale of the book and the extraordinary men and women who created that arc of healing that we're also grateful for. And we're grateful for you, Tim, and for spending time with us tonight. Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure, Michaela. Thanks for having me.
Yes, thank you.
I do have one quick little note, and that is about our next book club. On Thursday, December 2nd, Dennis Adams will be with us in his book called Motives. It's a detective book. And in December, we have a second book, and that will be on Thursday, December 16th. Clarissa Markowitz, I hope I'm saying that correctly, Christmas in Whimsy, just a really delightful book that my daughter-in-law suggested we have. And Clarissa is a City Honors graduate, so we're really delighted that they'll be joining us. And I hope you'll all join us at our next second Friday when we have an opportunity to meet Tim in person. Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
Have a good night. Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Michaela. Thanks, Mary.